Good morning and welcome to today's SnapTech IT webinar. The topic for today is understanding the new SEC cybersecurity requirements for investment advisors in 2023. My name is Ted Hulsey. I'm Chief Revenue Officer for SnapTech IT. And today I'm joined by our co-founder and CEO, Carl Bickmore. Carl, how are you?
Doing well, great. Thanks for having me, Ted.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining in for the live session. We do encourage you to ask questions as we go along, make it interactive. We'll try to address your questions on the fly. So use the GoToWebinar application to drop any questions that come in. And we'll also have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of today's webinar. We always record our webinars, and we will have this up on YouTube within a couple hours, or at worst case by tomorrow morning. And so if you have a colleague who you want to share the recording with, please go ahead and check us out on our YouTube channel. Let's talk a little bit about today's agenda, and then we'll get into the content. So Carl and I are going to tag team this. And the thing we're going to do first is I'm going to take on kind of like the first bullet here, really, and just talk about the cyber threat landscape and talk about what we're seeing in terms of what companies are up against in today's environment in 2023, and also more specifically what investment advisors and folks in the financial community are facing. And then we'll go really one level deeper. And Carl will pick up the conversation there and talk specifically about the regulations that the SEC is promulgating and will soon be enforcing for investment advisors. And then what do industry participants need to do about it? And how can SnapTech be one of the resources that can help you along the way? So I think before we hop into the content, these webinars, we design them for clients and we design them for the overall community. So some folks on the line may not know who we are. SnapTech IT, we are a security first managed service provider with offices in Atlanta, Georgia, Phoenix, Arizona, and San Francisco, California. We serve clients in really two different ways. For smaller organizations, say in the 20 to 100 employee range, we provide what we call fully managed IT services. So that's really a situation where you don't have anybody on staff who has, wears an IT hat, and really you rely on your outsourced vendor to do everything for you on the IT and technology front. So that's one of our most common ways we serve clients. But also for larger organizations that have, say, somewhere between 75 and 500 employees, we do what's called co-managed IT. And by co-managed IT, that's really where an organization might have an internal IT director or an IT team, and we divide and conquer on meeting the needs of the organization from an IT perspective. So the company will outsource some of the IT functions to us and then perform some of them internally. So that's literally all we want to say about ourselves. Let's change gears and now talk about the overall cyber landscape and some of the big trends we're seeing. This data on this slide comes from the SonicWall 2023 Cyber Threat Report. It's a really good report. We happen to mostly use Sophos equipment and Sophos security technologies in all of our deployments, but the folks over at SonicWall do a really good job summarizing what's happening overall in the industry. And what you see is that, wow, the pandemic unleashed a whole host of impacts on society and changes. And one of the big ones was it was a terrible time on the cybersecurity threat landscape and cyber front. There was really an explosion of ransomware attacks during the pandemic. Those really crescendoed in 2021. They dropped down slightly in 2022, and I think have pretty much moderated from there. So it's at a reduced level from the peak in 2021, but it's still at an elevated level. And the other data point that came out of this research from SonicWall is that ransomware remains the top concern for business decision makers and leaders in organizations. So this really impacts financial companies, but it impacts all different industries. And really, if you're not that familiar with ransomware, the biggest cost of a ransomware attack is downtime. Because when you get a ransomware attack, some or all of your computing infrastructure gets encrypted by the cyber criminals, and they will ransom it to give you the encryption keys to get back in business and get back in production in your environment. So one of the major costs is the cost of downtime, the cost of damage to your brand reputation, but also the cold hard cash of paying the ransom, if that is the ultimate one of the solutions, can also be terribly expensive. The goal always should be to have a resilient IT infrastructure and cybersecurity position so that you don't have to pay ransoms because you have really good backups, you have good recovery capabilities. But sometimes organizations will find themselves where paying the ransom is the only choice. The other trend is that intrusions of various kinds, hit an all-time high in 2022 at 6.3 trillion intrusions. So that was a 19% increase over 2021. Let's talk about the other big trend we're seeing. Cybersecurity is a huge reality for everybody today, but especially financial organizations. Those business impacts are coming in the form of increased regulatory compliance requirements, and that's really the focus for today's webinar. And so we'll get into that in detail. But the other business issue a lot of organizations are facing is that cyber liability insurance is something we recommend for all of our clients. It's something we recommend for all savvy businesses. It is a form of insurance that will give you financial resources when and if a cyber event occurs. And often there are really extreme costs in dealing with a cyber incident. So we highly recommend it. But the interesting thing that's happening is that it's getting harder and harder to actually secure cyber liability insurance. And that's because the carriers that underwrite this space are discovering in the past, you saw the trends on ransomware attacks in 2021. They're paying out a lot of, there's a lot of funds going out the door in terms of covering damages and incidents. And so they're raising the bar in terms of their underwriting standards, and they're raising the bar on the insureds, their customers of the insurance product, and requiring companies to do a lot more in terms of investing in cyber defense measures because the threats are so real and they're happening with such frequency. The third big trend is that, and Carl's going to get into this in a little bit more detail, the SEC has really been focused for the past 6 to 7, 8 years, really in raising the alarm with the financial community about the risks from cyber incidents and the cybersecurity risks and the requirements that organizations need to prioritize around cyber. And what you're seeing is that more and more the SEC is fining and conducting enforcement actions against organizations, both big and small, because organizations are not making the adequate investments and taking the adequate steps to protect their organizations. And the main mechanism the SEC uses is an audit mechanism and where they will investigate different organizations. And if they find serious deficiencies, they will impose strict financial penalties on organizations that are regulated by the SEC. So you can go to the SEC website and scroll through and see all the enforcement actions, and there are many, especially on the cyber front, that have started in the past kind of 3 or 4 years. So with that, let's change gears, and Carl, kind of talk to us, maybe take a step back and give us a kind of a longer view of where the SEC has been on this journey and where we stand today.
Yeah, sure, you bet. I mean, so I think there's a few things about this. I mean, one of the things I think is really specific to financial institutions, investment advisors, and other folks surrounding those industries is the cyber incident attack functionality or a ransomware event, whatever the thing might be, could be your customer information getting out. These are industries that operate in a very high trust point of view with their customers. And so even probably of all the customers we work with, these are the customers that also have significant impact from having a problem, a break of trust with their clients. Either their clients' information becoming public knowledge, or in just simply showing that they perhaps haven't done all the things necessary to be trusted to be holding the client's information or conducting investment activities for them or helping them manage financial information. And so in my experience, most of these folks that are working in these organizations, let's just say you're all used to the SEC cybersecurity questionnaires. You've been getting them for a while, and you can see how these, the timeline here in 2017, they started really taking note. I mean, at that point in time, ransomware and security events were already raging. And back then we used to talk about how, hey, they doubled this year, they tripled this year. And yes, after many, many years of 3 or 4 times the amount, we finally hit this like peak zone where it's not doubling or tripling or quadrupling the amount of attacks each year. It's still like hundreds of times higher than it was in 2017. And so it's kind of it's maybe part of it's to say is like maybe we've seen the end of the growth of it, but it's still now the new reality. And at some level, I can appreciate why the SEC sees that it's responsible, because when we're out there talking to small businesses or financial institutions, even large ones, the problem is that there's a lot of really smart financial people that really know what they're doing. They know how to read balance sheets. They know how to investigate due diligence. They know how to be properly insured, but they fundamentally don't know how to do risk management of their own IT. They just don't know this piece. And sometimes they go to their internal IT guy and go, hey, IT guy, you know all this stuff, right? So we're secure, right? And they just fundamentally haven't learned how to manage this or ask the right questions. And I think what the SEC is doing here is putting a newer set of requirements in place that are going to force the hand of the management teams becoming more involved in understanding the cybersecurity risk and putting protections in place. And so we're seeing as each of these things trick along here, checking off the things, they're really leading to something. And now really we're now at a spot where the rules are going into effect. And that's within a month here now, right? I think it's in October, I believe. And so here we are, new requirements coming online that you need to be aware of. Let's head to the next slide and talk about what some of those things are. The policies and procedures place is one of the big ones, because this will change how you behave. The way the rule states it is it wants you to take a risk-based approach to your policies and procedures. So the question is, what does that mean? I think there's a lot of great ways you can look this up and you can become familiar with it. And I think like one of the great resources out there for policies, procedures, or guidelines is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or the NIST organization. This is the governing organization that has all sorts of experts do all this hours and hours of research and all these case examples and studies. And it's what they've used to guide the government standards for federal entities in operating. It has also led to many other frameworks. Folks like FINRA and the FFIEC are all looking at these things and guidance. And there's some really great risk management guidelines coming out from NIST. But the big key things is like it's not just enough to say, hey, we've got an information security policy. It needs to now have a risk governance element to it, where you're doing testing, annual risk assessments. You need to be concerned with the risk of authentication, the risk of information disclosure, and you need to be building policies with controls around protecting that stuff. And so it's not enough to just say, hey, we have insurance and we have a policy and here's the list of practices we do. They're asking you to have a risk management behavior, regular check-ins, regular assessments, reports, and management decisions and documentation that you're doing that, if that makes sense. And so some of the 5 key elements that listed here, you need to have risk assessments, security and access management needs to be controlled. That's like how you log in. Do you have multi-factor authentication, or does it just a username and password to find important information? Is it public available? Is it protected in other ways? Threat and vulnerability management, incident response recovery. I think one of the things I think is really interesting to read about their expectations of policies and reporting is that, you know, there is an accepted level of you can have an incident. It's not saying that you now have to prevent every possible incident that could happen. That's probably an unrealistic thing, but they want to know that you're really good at responding to it and you know exactly how to do it and how to set it aside and how to properly alert people to that incident. And so part of the policy piece of this is incident response and recovery. How good are you? How documented? How quickly? How much can you minimize the attack or the incident? And how much can you minimize the interruption in your ability to do your services? That's one of the key questions you have to answer when you are doing alerting and announcing of cyber reporting of it, if you will, to your investors and the SEC. So that's the biggest first one, and to me, that's like a real behavioral change request that they're asking for.
So Carl, let me jump in with a couple questions. So when you talk, I mean, I think one big piece here, of course, is policies and procedures, but there also is just a cold hard reality that there's often a lot of missing cybersecurity technologies that are needed to actually address, say, robust threat and vulnerability management. Can you give a couple examples of the kinds of technologies that will often be new for these organizations that require additional investment?
Sure. Well, heading down the elements. So it's great to have a policy for something, but what does that policy mean? Well, if you have a policy that's like restricting user security and access management, that means that you can't just have any old computer logging into your network that isn't, for instance, controlled and managed by your organization and being managed by some type of system that has policy directive, like a directory system, like something that Microsoft provides with their Azure or their now newly rebranded Entra system, or an Active Directory server, if you will. If you don't have something controlling the identity and access management in a centralized, manageable, reportable, and alertable way, you are missing that technology. Information management, do you have data loss protection tools in place? Threat and vulnerability management, do you have something actually managing the patching of your systems and looking at the configuration of your environment for security? Do you have policies and procedures on how to harden your computer and information systems, your networks, your firewalls? Do you have a regular process of testing and validating that? Do you have your cloud resources backed up properly? Most people don't know that they aren't even backing up their Office 365 or their Google Workspace. That can lead to a data loss event. Do they have things like application control? Are they controlling administrative access to their individual computers, or can users just install things? There are tools to manage all of these things that would be necessary in order to meet what these policies are intended to do.
That's right. So there's a lot there. And every day we specialize in helping organizations navigate some of this complexity. But let's kind of take that last bullet, incident response, and then go to this next slide, which is mandatory cyber incident reporting. And let's talk about what are the implications of this? Well, first, what's the SEC require? And then what are the implications for organizations?
Yeah. Well, so this was a very controversial part of this. So as per many government entities, as they began to develop these rules and they finally got them to a spot where they're ready to document, they opened them up for a comment period, as many do. There's a lot of concerns around this, like within 8 hours, can you have reasonably assessed the actual incident? That's pretty tough. Sometimes that's too soon, or that's really tough to be in there, but this is the new standard. If you have a reasonable basis to conclude, they want you to tell that it's happening. And so, have your insurance people ready, have your attorneys ready, because you need to be writing that report fairly quickly now in this process in order to remain compliant with these guidelines. The other things is significant advisor and fund cybersecurity incidents. So they're not saying, hey, a single mailbox has become compromised is a significant event, unless, of course, it leads to some type of major data leak that maybe involves 1,000 customers or something. But the point is that a single wire fraud issue, an individual mailbox, an individual virus infection on a computer, that's not what we're talking about here. Those are incidences, but those are not ones that consider significant. They do have some guidelines that you can look into. It's a little bit vague, in my opinion, but I would say, when it comes to things involving multiple customers or significant dollar amounts or significant data issues, that's when you're going to need to report it. Some of the other guidelines here: significantly disrupts or degrades your ability to maintain critical operations. So if you as an organization can't operate, that's considered significant. If people who don't have or shouldn't be authorized to access funds or information about your client base reasonably have access to many customers or that kind of information, that would be considered significant as well, even if it's one person who can see many customer information things. And so these are some of the guidelines around it, but this mandatory cyber incident reporting is controversial. I understand why they're doing it, because the natural inclination is for companies who have an incident is to hide it and to not want to tell their people because of the reputation damage that comes from it. And you could have customers that are swept up in this wanting to leave your services. And so it's understandable why people would not desire to shout from the rooftops of when something went wrong. But I also think that, the average consumer is more savvy than they used to. It is like, yeah, I guess nobody's immune. But I think the real thing is if you do good forms and effective forms of communication, you can gain the respect of your customer in this process too, because you can quickly identify, you can say we're following our procedures, you can say these are the things that we've done and this is why we believe it's mitigated to this level, and this is our common practice and process. So you also have an opportunity in your reporting cycle to show your professionalism, your exactness, and I think that people appreciate that and don't go running for the hills, but rather think I'm with an organization who does the right thing. They're A, telling me, and B, look how well they're taking care of it. So, but that's it's a big rule change.
Yeah,
and
so I mean,
period of time.
yeah, and I think so. The bad news is 48 hours is not a lot of time. The good news is there's at least a materiality dimension to this requirement where it has to be something significant that it has occurred. But we've got a couple questions that have come in, but Carl, tell me a little bit about what organizations need to have in place from an incident response perspective to be able to respond to this sort of disclosure requirement within 48 hours. What are some of the things that would be on the checklist to get after that readiness, that level of readiness?
Well, my opinion is when it comes to disclosure, it's the best resource to have handy is a savvy, well-informed attorney that knows this ruling and understands the law, and so that you don't say things in a way that could put you into further legal bind or open you for additional liability or risk. The vultures will begin circling, and your customers deserve the right kind of response, and the regulatory agencies deserve a correct and accurate response, but you don't want to share either more information or misinformation. And the other thing I think is really great, that a good incident response policy declares who's involved in the communication process. Like I said, having an attorney involved is really highly recommended and just ready to go. You wouldn't want to be trying to find that attorney when the incident happens. You'd want to already have an established relationship. And once again, ideally, you have an insurance provider who's at the table helping with that process. The last thing you want to do is just, the average advisor on the phone or one of your staff members starting to say, hey, we've been hacked and everything's blowing up, and really giving out incorrect or improper information. And so it's really good that your incident response policy has strong communication protocols. And here's the other thing, you want to have practiced or tested this before the incident happens so that your people know, because you can have the best policy ever, but if when the emergency or the incident occurs, people will panic and they won't have good reflexes of, hey, let's go read what our policy says and look at the number of who are supposed to call or who's supposed to be alerted to begin this process. But if they practiced a couple of times, now the reflex is there. And so those are a couple of things about the incident reporting. It's like you want to report it correctly and on time. And I would not want to do that without good legal advice and without my people knowing that they're not supposed to just start talking about this to anybody who asks.
Fair enough. So a couple questions came in. John asked, will this PowerPoint be shared so we can review it with our management team? And the answer is yes. I mean, we will, I'll quickly take a poll if somebody wants PDF copies of the slides. And if you just kindly respond to me, we'll get back to you with that. We always take a recording of it and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel as well. Now, John had another follow-up question, and he says, does SnapTech offer mock audit services to its customers?
Yeah, we do. one of our services is we help with assessments to kind of help you get a lay of the land of where you're at. It's a second opinion, if you will. We work with your current IT staff or provider to do that. And we'll give you a good lay of the land, and we'll put it up against these rules and say, hey, they want you to do risk assessment. They want your user security access. How are you protecting information? How are you doing threat vulnerability management? What's your incident response policy? And then we can offer tabletop services to practice an incident, and we can also offer mock audit services where in our assessment process we say these are the things we think you're going to come across in a potential audit, and these are the ways that we would recommend that you would either change or respond or understand what that question means. And frankly, for our engaged customers that we work with on a regular basis, we assist in the answering of SEC questionnaires as well.
All right, super. All right, keep the questions coming. Let's go to the third element, which is disclosure in the different SEC forms or in your registration statements.
Yeah, I mean, this is, look, it's saying that not only do you need to let the SEC know, but it's now putting new restrictions on disclosure to your customers as well. In your engagement process, they need to know that if you had anything in the last couple of years and what the nature of those things were. And you need to know about it with your service providers as well, which is interesting. And so, look, it's not just that you need to say when they happen, you need to be letting people know that they have happened as well.
Okay.
I don't know if there's a lot more to say about that other than people are like, I don't want to talk about this, but now I'm being required to, and I understand.
Well, yeah, and I think it probably it goes to kind of maybe the next big area of requirements is keeping really solid records of what has happened, and for a relatively long period of time. In the business world, 5 years, that's quite a long time. And so talk to us about record keeping, good discipline around books and records, and especially around keeping track of all these cyber details over time.
Yeah, look, this is just a general approach that's now being required to keep the records and to be able to produce them on demand upon request or disclose them when required, and so forth, so on. And so they're declaring it's a 5-year period here, and you need to have occurrences and any of that kind of information ready and available when asked for by people that are allowed to ask. An auditor, for instance, could ask this 2 years to a customer. These are written reports. So what does this mean? Well, when you're creating your policies, like a risk assessment policies, one of the things you're going to want to adopt is a practice that says, hey, every year we review our policies. And this would now say, not only do you need to do it, but you need to show that it was done and people are signing off that they reviewed it. And here's our record saying it happened. And you need to keep that for a rolling 5 years. So they're putting some requirements around these policies to show that they actually are being put into action. So like one of the things that we've helped a lot of customers is develop an audit or assessment calendar of action, or a cybersecurity calendar, if you will, that says, hey, we have these controls that we're gonna do these risk things. So hey, in a monthly basis, we'll do this activity, on a quarterly basis this, on a biannual, and then on an annual. And so you kind of have that calendared out and set aside, and whoever in your firm is handling the information security officer role is typically the person that's controlling and causing that calendar to go into action. There are certainly several of our customers that say, okay, SnapTech, we'd like you to do this monthly audit, report it to us so that we can have a risk meeting and see the results of that control and action. And so putting together a formal calendar and then having a system for recording the actions of those meetings, the notes of those meetings, and who attended in an approval cycle, that's part of that risk management approach that they're talking about to your policies. It's not enough to just say, hey, we've got this policy and dust it off and hand it over when the auditor asks. You need to show that you're meaningfully doing things, regularly reviewing, and that you're keeping records of that. Now, how you do that, it could be as simple as like, a formal logging system, a documentation system. We use a ticketing system to help us with this. It makes it really easy for us to do this process. because it sets up the automated calendar actions and items and reportings to be taken. But there are several approaches that are considered acceptable, but ultimately you need to show documentation that these events are happening, and it's not something to be created on the fly. It needs to be done as you go.
That's right. And we have a lot of experience with, I mean, why don't you talk to everyone about, I mean, we go through a specific kind of cybersecurity audit every year called a SOC 2. And so like on our own organization, we have an independent process that subjects us to scrutiny every year. Talk to us a little bit about that. What's the value to us and what's our value to our clients because we go through that process?
Yeah, I mean, many of the chief information security officers at financial institutions are going to be familiar with the SOC 2. We do the type 2, which is, of course, it's not looking at just a point in time in a day, it's looking at a period of time, and our period of time is the entire year for our internal process. And so when an auditor comes, they could say, hey, okay, show me you follow this due diligence process when this new employee is hired, show me their background check, show me their credit check, and show me that they were trained in this way. And so we have to say, here's all the employees we had, and they just tell us which one, and then we go, because anything within the period is acceptable from an audit standpoint, right? But look, which audit you do relates to what type of institution you are. So SOC 2 Type 2 fits for our service-based organization providing IT services and backup services and security services that we do. There are different ones that could apply to other organizations depending, but that's a really good general one that's fundamentally accepted. ISO standard is a common one, having an FFIEC audit's another one. But anyway, the point is that you need to have these audit processes as part of your cycle. We do this, so it's kind of taught us how to do it. We're now entering our 9th year of doing that on an annual basis as an organization, so it's something we've become very used to. And like I said, we've developed methodologies around using our ticketing system for workflow and automation and documentation of that. That's just a good methodology that we found, and it's certainly something we've become familiar with. And I don't know if that was the answer to the question, but I know we just barely kicked off our audit this week, our annual audit, because our audit period ends in November. So it goes December 1st through November 30th every year. So.
Yeah, I think I asked the question mostly to kind of get at that you have to be super process driven on this and leverage software tools to stay organized, to make sure, like you said, Carl, we happen to use our ticketing system to make sure that we have really detailed project plans, and we're able to march through these processes throughout the year so that you create the audit trail that will be required when you do need to substantiate this either to a regulatory authority or to an auditor, a third-party auditor, and you just need to leverage software tools to make sure that you have all of this documentation. And then in this case, they're requiring folks to have documentation up to 5 years. So pretty.
Yeah, it definitely makes it more reliable and easier. It's like, for us, it's operating off of a ticket calendar item that pops up and says, okay, hold quarterly risk management meeting. Here's the agenda. Here's the attendees, and everybody's got it on their calendar. We didn't have to think and remember, oh, I got to schedule this thing. It just pops up for us, and we just need to follow the process, right? And so, yeah, to that end, that can certainly make this a lot more manageable, a lot easier to be exact, and a lot easier to be documented in a way that will work according to the requirement of keeping a record book, as they say.
Yep. Okay, well, let's change gears. So those were the 4 key elements of what the SEC's requirements that were promulgated in 2022. They went out for the comment period. There were, I think, 2 phases of comment periods. And I think we're at the phase where these new regulations will go into the Federal Register probably in the month of October if everything stays on schedule. Sometimes these things do slip time-wise, but that's the overall timeline. So all registered, we really zeroed in on today's conversation on the requirements for registered investment advisors, RIAs, because that's most commonly the kinds of organizations we're working with. But the SEC also has similar sort of requirements they're putting on publicly held companies in terms of cyber disclosures and other regulated entities. So we kind of covered the 4 main buckets, and for a lot of registered investment advisors, this is new territory. and now the reality is going to be here. So if you feel like your organization is not ready, or you have to play catch up, or maybe your internal staff needs additional outside expertise, working with a managed service provider that's focused on working with financial institutions and clients is a really good approach. Let's change gears, Carl, and talk a little bit about our capabilities as an organization. How do we approach these things, just as a little bit of extra information?
Sure. I mean, look, I think that it's a funny thing because a lot of people just think every IT person just naturally knows cybersecurity as well. I think some of the folks out there, I'm starting to see the savviness increase. So they realize, okay, just because I know how to install a printer or make this computer setup work great, or make a backup run, or even install a firewall, doesn't mean I actually know how to do cybersecurity kind of things. But I've maintained for a long time, and part of this is because I worked at Charles Schwab for a while, and then I also taught at a college where I developed computer information security curriculum. I've always maintained that good IT has security throughout all of it. And I think that's what we mean when we say security first. Is I think that you can hire IT people and hire cybersecurity people, but good IT people do know how to do cybersecurity, and that is kind of our approach. And I think that that's unusual, to be perfectly frank. Most IT people are great at systems, they're great at handling the fires, they're great at making that application open up and run, or getting that database backed up, but they oftentimes don't have a good process-driven approach, and they're not incorporating security at each level. For us, we've taken the cue from the National Institute of Standards of Technology, NIST, and we've built all of our offerings and all of our trainings in our internal language around their terminologies and ways of thinking of cybersecurity. This is why we have identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. These are the ways that we built our offering. And so when we assess, we help you break it down in this way. And this just so happens to be extremely compatible approach to the new policy requirements. And so, and I think when you think about IT, it's not right to think I'm just going to go get an IT guy that's going to do all this stuff, put all this stuff in place, and oh yeah, we don't have multi-factor, so we'll have them go do that. And now go ahead and write me some policies. I think it's better to take the approach to say, well, what is the policy you're going to take? What controls do we need in place to do that? And then how are we going to implement those controls? And then how are we going to audit those controls? That's a more comprehensive approach. And making sure you're covering each of these 5 areas is extremely important, because what happens when you just cherry pick, or you just ask the IT guy to do a few things that isn't thinking comprehensively like this, they'll do a couple of things that they know or understand, but they'll really never get to those other things that put the whole picture together comprehensively. And very rarely will they be actually documenting and following procedure in a governed or controlled sort of way. And that is really, in my opinion, what good IT looks like. And it happens to be very compatible with this approach of taking a risk-based approach to your IT in general, which is really what I think the SEC is asking for now. We call our assessments risk assessments, because we want the business owner to understand what the risk implications and the business cases are for any IT thing that is or isn't happening in their organization. So that's why we use these frameworks. That's why we pay attention to this stuff, because it's actually well documented and understood. It's just not commonly done by IT people, believe it or not. So.
Yeah, and I think just to make a couple comments here, so that the NIST cybersecurity framework specifically has been called out by the SEC as a standard and a framework that they really embrace and trust. And so that's been called out in many of their guidelines throughout the years, dating all the way back to 2017. And then more specifically, so the NIST cybersecurity framework, when we do a risk assessment for a prospective client or an existing client, we use this as all the controls that are specified in the NIST cybersecurity framework, we check every single one of them. And so for a new client, it's often a kind of a surprising experience to them, because we get to a lot of, there's like 100, I think it's 108, Carl, if I have it right, 108 controls.
110 in the 171, which is a really common assessment we do. Okay. To just be clear, cybersecurity framework itself doesn't list a ton of controls. It lists guidelines and things, but The controls actually come out in the 171, which is a federal government subcontractor control. But there's 110 of them, which is a lot, and it's comprehensive to these categories. Yes.
Right. Yeah, and just to give folks a taste for when we do one of these assessments, literally you'll end up with a detailed document that'll take you through every single one of these controls and let you know whether we, in our judgment, whether you're in good shape or satisfactory or at risk. And then that is really what helps you to understand what needs to be roadmap, what needs to be understood from a risk perspective, what risks need to be managed, and then how do you manage that going forward with a proactive roadmap and plan to get at some of the improvements that are required to continue to raise the bar on your cybersecurity posture.
And I think the overall message is, look, not every control applies to every company or makes sense for every organization, but then you just say that it doesn't apply. But the point is I think the key is it's comprehensive. It's a wider scope approach to make sure you're not adding risk to your company. You might be like, hey, I asked my IT guy to secure us and they did backup and antivirus. We're good, right? It's like, well, I don't know. What about your ability to detect an intruder? What about your ability to manage a threat? Do you have policies on how to respond to an incident? And so these are the things that oftentimes get forgotten when you don't have that comprehensive approach.
Right, and I think the assessment process is kind of the beginning of a journey for folks who are new to working with us. Talk to us about how that journey proceeds.
Yeah, look, for some customers, we're just there to help them with the assessment, and we're going to give them and their IT provider that feedback, and they're just getting that second look or that outside opinion, which is an appropriate way to not have the person delivering it do their assessment. That's a good practice. But if you're in the process of considering like engaging us in a full-time approach, one thing that's I think different about us is we actually won't bring you on as a customer unless you want to follow our proven process. And our proven process always starts with a paid assessment. It's comprehensive, and it really gives you a big picture. And I think one of the biggest things we do in that process is spend a lot of time educating the management team or the ownership team of the customer about how to better manage and assess and risk understand IT services. Because a lot of times they have gaps of knowledge because they're not experts in IT, they're experts at helping deliver fund management or giving investment advice. And as such, I find they oftentimes need to better understand to be able to make those decisions. And so our risk assessment is about informing them, but it also can lead to us to giving a proposal for ongoing services, which begins a very specific onboarding process that does documentations, writing procedures unique to each customers. Sometimes you have things that need to be fixed or updated and you want to get after them. So we go from onboarding to any remediation process projects that might be needed. And then it's jumping straight into any ongoing support where we have 24/7, 365 monitoring. We have folks available across the country in our different office locations to answer support calls to come on site. And then, from there, any ongoing, if you have any special projects, maybe you want to change your CRM, maybe there's something you want to do around your accounting practice, that there could be a unique special project. And then there's just ongoing management where we do quarterly business reviews, where we provide reporting on your audit items, we provide reporting on your risk management items, and also just to ask for feedback and generally help you make sure you know what your roadmap is going forward, usually in a 2-year running cycle, and some customers are planning out to 5 years on their IT, but generally we're asking for about a 2-year picture, so you know how to budget costs for this year, next year, and the year after, if you will. Or at least some of it. And that's the kind of the cycle we find. We call it a proven process because we know that if you take this approach of first identifying everything in assessment, getting on the same page on how it works, going through a practice and deliberate onboarding process, fixing the things necessary, off to support, it's a very successful process. You really de-risk your company. You can be quite good on your compliance facing things if that's your needs. And the ongoing management is going to provide an IT system with very few issues.
Yeah, and I think one thing to really keep in mind is that the regulatory authorities are often, they're not looking for perfection out of the gate. They're looking for a spirit of risk management going on and a proven track record of continuous improvement in terms of investing in cybersecurity measures. So, I mean, I think one thing that we're always talking with clients about is the realities of budget. I mean, sometimes we'll bring on a new client that really is in a pretty immature state in where they are in cybersecurity, and it will take us 2 or 3 years to get them to a point where we could really say, wow, you know, we've dramatically improved the situation. It takes time. Time is money. You know, doing projects requires labor and expertise and qualified engineers to do a lot of this work, and it requires often investments in different new you know, infrastructure or software solutions and that sort of thing. So we really work on a roadmap basis, and we'll be doing special projects with a client over time to get them in that mode of continuous improvement. And I think that's really what you want to have. If you undergo an audit, if you're showing that track record of continuous improvement, you're in a much better spot.
Yeah, well, and regardless of how you do or who does your IT, this is a good process. Don't skip a good, thoughtful, comprehensive assessment before you start making IT decisions.
That's right.
Know what you have before you're deciding how to protect it, how to do it. You know, so.
All right, so we're in that phase. So additional time for questions. So please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A log. Let's see. So one question here from Steve is, he said, this seems kind of overwhelming. You know, where do we get started?
Yeah, I mean, I can appreciate that. There's a lot of detail. When you get into these policy things, we've all seen those documents. They're large, they're complicated. I think it actually can be simple, but I think a lot of it does come down to, you know, whoever's managing this organization needs to become just a little more IT management savvy and understanding all these pieces, and cyber savvy, if you will. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of, you got to start by getting a hold of what you actually have, knowing all the assets, knowing how they're configured, knowing where all the risk points are, getting them documented. That's what an assessment is for. That's why we insist on starting there, because I can't be so bold as to tell you how I think your IT should run or what things you should do or what it would cost if I don't actually know what you have and have looked at how it's configured, right? And the business owner rarely has somebody who can explain it in business terms and in easy to understand ways how this stuff works, and then make a good risk decision of like, oh, okay, I need to do that now, but this one can wait, and this one maybe will do, but I don't know, you know, kind of thing. So if you want to make those kind of decisions, which I think we all do, you should be doing it informed, not just simply relying on somebody saying that I'll tell you to do this, don't worry about the rest. It should be informed where you understand the risk piece. And so I think you can demystify it, you can take some of the overwhelming piece out of it through a very good assessment with a really good explanation process in that's not full of techno speak and garble, you know.
Yeah, we'll give you the gory details, but we will deliver you an executive summary, and we'll spend 2 hours together going over the details and talking about it, what the findings are from a business and risk management perspective that a leadership team can understand and should understand. So, our risk assessment process is really something we do with all new clients, and periodically with the organizations that require it from a compliance perspective. So I think that exhausts all the questions. So with that, we'll end a couple minutes early. Again, I'll email everybody who is on today's, registered for today's event, to see if you need copies of the slides. And then a recording of today's session will be available on our YouTube channel. And we look forward, we host a webinar every month. Sometimes we go deep on a particular topic for a particular industry. Sometimes we're taking a more horizontal approach and talking about general tech trends or best practices. And so keep an eye out. We always we'll invite you to upcoming events. So we look forward to having you join us as we head in near the fall. So thanks a lot for joining us for today's live session. And Carl, thanks for sharing your insights and wisdom on today's webinar.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you on a future event. Take care now.